When Michael O'Brien shot dead a man outside a pub, he would have no idea how harsh justice in the criminal world could be, or just how far-reaching his actions would be. This shooting sparked a chain of events which saw the executions of John and Joan Stirland, which was a bitter reaction to the death of Colin Gunn's nephew, Jamie. The Gunns held Mrs. Stirling's son Michael O'Brien responsible for the teenager's demise, and this is how Jamie's death sparked a chain of events that led to Colin Gunn's downfall. Colin Gunn was one of the most feared men in the UK. He was from the Bestwood estate in Nottinghamshire. In the early 90s, both he and his brother, David, were steadily clocking up convictions such as burglary, theft, handling stolen goods and violence. And like other criminal gangs, they built up their enterprise by relying on the people they had grown up with and whom they could trust. All would become members of the Bestwood Cartel, a name coined by the gang itself, and the brothers were united. The Gunn brothers were people that you certainly did not want to mess with. So it begins with the murder of Marvin Bradshaw. He was the best friend of Jamie Gunn, and he was shot dead in front of him outside the Sporting Chance pub in Bulwell. Marvin was a 22-year-old shop fitter for no previous convictions, and he had been driving Jamie and his friends away from the pub after a lock-in. The fatal shot was meant for Jamie Gunn after an argument earlier that night. One of the men later convicted of Mr. Bradshaw's murder, Michael O'Brien, had been refused entry to the Sporting Chance, and he had an argument with Jamie and another man, and one man had hit O'Brien above the eye with an ashtray. A furious O'Brien contacted Gary Salmon, a criminal associate, and they met, and Salmon collected a single-barrel shotgun before they changed into dark clothing, returning on foot to the Sporting Chance pub. As Marvin drove Jamie away, O'Brien and Salmon strolled towards them, and one fired the fatal shot. Marvin was shot in the back of the head, and he died later that day. So how, you may ask, does this murder link to the death of Jamie Gunn? It's because he was also in the car when his best friend Marvin was killed. Jamie Gunn was 18 at the time, and he held Marvin as he died. Jamie Gunn was the nephew of Colin Gunn. As we mentioned, he was somebody that you did not want to mess with. Colin Gunn was like a father to his nephew Jamie. Jamie's father had deserted him when he was just 8 months old, and although he lived with his mum, stepdad and 3 brothers and sisters, he always remained close to his uncles, especially Colin. As a teenager, he hung around in many of the same pubs as the older Gunns and looked up to them. On August 2nd, 2004, aged just 19, Jamie Gunn passed away, and although the official cause of death was listed as pneumonia, it's largely believed that he was on a downward spiral caused by drink and drugs after witnessing the shooting of his best friend. When O'Brien was arrested, he blamed the murder on Gary Salmon, who he had been with on the night. Salmon was a friend of his who was already known to the police. He was 32, and at the time he was said to have associates across the country and went by a string of nicknames including Fish, Lol and G. It was the courageous testimony of 2 teenage girls who were in Salmon's flat one night that led to a conviction. One of them heard O'Brien say, "I shot him, he was a bad man." The prosecutor, Peter Joyce, at the time described to the jury what happened at Salmon's flat that night, saying O'Brien was given the gun and pointed it at one of the girls. He pulled the trigger and there was a click. He said, "That's what I'm going to do to him." The men left the flat on foot and headed towards a pub, and minutes later one of the girls heard a bang which was also heard by the landlady of the pub. They were in a Renault Laguna car with the driver's window smashed, which was seen by police officers nearby on a grass verge. Michael O'Brien was later jailed for life for Marvin Bradshaw's murder. Gary Salmon had disappeared immediately after the killing before eventually being caught and jailed for life for his part in Marvin Bradshaw's murder. As the judge passed sentence, Richard Powell told him, "You killed a wholly innocent man and have shown absolutely no remorse. It was a deliberate and calculated murder." When O'Brien was found guilty of the murder, he reacted by throwing a glass of water over the public gallery before ranting at the parents of the man he had killed, Lyndon and Christine, telling them, "I'm not bothered. I'm a bad boy. It means nothing to me. Your son looked like a donut with a big hole in his head. I know where you live." He was ordered to serve a minimum of 24 years, but this was not enough to satisfy Colin Gunn, who had seen his nephew Jamie spiral out of control after witnessing his best friend dying in his arms. A former undercover police officer who worked alongside Colin Gunn said Jamie and Colin were very close. Colin made up his mind that because of what happened to Jamie, O'Brien and his family were going to get the same. In other words, Michael O'Brien's imprisonment wasn't enough for Gunn, and it left only Michael's mother and stepfather as targets for a revenge attack. So Michael's parents, John and Joan Stirland, lived in Carlton in Nottingham. Just 3 days after O'Brien was arrested, shortly after 10 p.m. on a Sunday evening, there were shots fired through the windows of their home. They were terrified and feared for their lives, and the couple told police that they were moving out that same night. They didn't stay in one place, they moved to North Yorkshire and then back to Nottingham before leaving police protection, moving to what they hoped would be a safe, peaceful life in a bungalow in Trusthorpe, a small coastal village in Lincolnshire. Trusthorpe was described as an isolated retirement and holiday community. It was an ideal choice for couples trying to stay out of the public eye. Renting a property, their landlord described them as perfect tenants and revealing that Mr. Stirling was claiming housing benefits. It's believed that the couple had been living under different names in Lincolnshire for about 6 months, and the move was triggered after a group of men had visited them late at night at their home in Carlton and told them they had 24 hours to get out or face the consequences. Even though that they'd escaped 80 miles away from their former home, you'd think that they'd stand a chance of remaining anonymous. But around 2 weeks before their deaths, John Stirling was walking along the beach near his new home when he bumped into a family friend who happened to be visiting from Nottingham. And that's when people in their former area started finding out about the Stirlings' new life, and it became the talk of the town. Colin Gunn had a man by the name of Charles Fletcher join Nottinghamshire Police at the age of 19, thus giving Gunn access to corrupt police officers. Charles Fletcher was being paid £2,000 a month by Gunn on top of his normal salary. In 2006, Charles Fletcher was jailed for 7 years for corruption. In the end, it was a former BT employee called Stephen Poundle who contacted his ex-colleagues who still worked at BT, asking them to search the computer systems. They did this, found the address details and handed over the address of the Stirlings. It should be noted that none of them, including Poundle, knew why the address was wanted. The BT employee was later convicted of illegally disclosing the information which led Gunn to the Stirlings. The two BT employees, Anthony Kelly and Andrew Pickering, later admitted computer misuse and received suspended sentences and were both sacked from BT. Said to enforce his leadership with extreme violence, stories abound of Colin Gunn breaking people's knuckles with a hammer or baseball bat, as well as nailing their hands to tables. However, their public persona was different though. Apparently to this day, in Bestwood, local residents still talk fondly about the firework displays that they used to do. There were also the security of the area. If anybody had any problem, nobody would go to the police, they would go to the Gunns to get that issue sorted out. So they had a real good reputation around the Bestwood estate. It was around 10:30 on Saturday 7th of August that a neighbour of the Stirlings noticed a man lurking by their front door. She didn't report it that night but spoke to Joan Stirling the next morning. Joan rang Nottinghamshire Police rather than the local Lincolnshire Police, as she had stayed in touch with them ever since the shooting. An officer called her back around 2 p.m. that day to discuss things. The police insisted that Mrs. Stirling was concerned but not panicked, stressing that she wanted them to be aware of what happened but that she wanted discretion. Minutes after Jonah put the phone down, two men wearing boiler suits and baseball caps pulled up outside the Stirlings' home in a black Volkswagen Passat and got out. Not long after they had returned to the car and drove off, the bungalow door was left ajar in their wake. 2 miles away, they dumped the Passat in a quiet country lane and set it alight. It was later confirmed that the car had been stolen on the 31st of July from Nottinghamshire. What happened inside the property? Mr. Stirling, in shorts and no top, was on the settee when he was shot, and his wife was in the bedroom when she was killed. Michael O'Brien's parents had been murdered. Now, prior to the killing, an officer from Nottingham Police passed the message on to Lincolnshire Police the same afternoon that he had spoken to Joan. As you remember, Joan didn't speak to Lincolnshire, she spoke to Nottinghamshire Police. And naturally, being 2004, the police forces in the UK being completely up to date with technology, this was done by fax. Unfortunately, Lincolnshire Police had no previous intelligence about the threat level that the Stirlings faced, as it was recorded under Nottinghamshire Police, and thus they didn't treat it as a priority. The duty inspector in the Lincolnshire control room that day was Phil Parkinson. He said the fax was on a sole piece of paper and made reference to shots being fired at the Stirlings' previous home in Nottingham. The fax also made reference to reports of a prowler at the Stirlings' home, and even though the couple were known targets, Parkinson was quoted as saying, "My answer to why I didn't deploy armed officers at the time was that based on the information I had, I didn't have enough to suggest a serious enough risk assessment." It was one page, so of course I didn't go into massive detail, and I'm pretty sure it didn't mention the name Gunn on there. It might have done, but not that I can remember. Anyway, it wasn't until 9:30 p.m. that officers visited the property, by which time the couple were already dead, having been shot in what press said at the time as it appeared to be a gangland style killing by two men dressed in black and wearing baseball caps, who were seen making their way into the semi-detached bungalow. Neighbours commented that they thought the bungalow was rented, saying that although the couple didn't mix with neighbours or the local community, they were keen gardeners. And one neighbour went on to say that their young grandchildren who had been visiting had only left the day before. With regards to the death of the Stirlings, there was an inquest, and the jury had told Notts police had let the couple down in a number of ways, and this had contributed directly to their deaths. The inquest found that Notts police failed to take reasonable steps to protect the couple. They did not put protective measures in place at their trust thought home, had not managed intelligence and information properly, and failed to investigate a series of reprisal attacks properly following the death of Marvin Bradshaw. And it also found Notts police failed to perform an adequate risk assessment on the threat to their lives, and had not warned the couple about the links Bestwood crime boss Colin Gunn had with the east coast of Lincolnshire. How was the murder of the Stirlings linked to Colin Gunn? So 6 days after Jamie Gunn's death, Colin and his associates had used those BT contacts to seek out the Stirlings' Lincolnshire hideaway on the coast and prepare for the gunman to strike. Mobile phone evidence put Colin Gunn and his associates John Russell and Michael McNee in the area of the Stirlings' home before their murders. It was believed that police had tracked over 7,000 phone calls during the investigation. When they arrested Gunn, he was quick to claim his innocence, telling police when interviewed that he was just on holiday at a caravan park close to where the killings took place, and that he went there most weekends. The crazy thing here is, despite having been mentioned or named in no less than 4 murders and over 50 shootings, Colin Gunn hadn't been charged with a single crime since 1998, and in fact even that crime in October 98 shows Gunn's influence. Colin was arrested for a brutal attack on a man outside the Astoria nightclub near the back of the Broadmarsh Centre. Oddly, the CCTV footage mysteriously went missing. Colin Gunn got a few hundred hours community service, and even then it's alleged that someone else actually did it for him. Ultimately, the case here is that nobody was convicted of the murder of John and Joan Stirland. However, on the 30th of June 2006, Colin Gunn was sentenced to 35 years for conspiring to murder the Stirlings. And his parting remarks to the jury were, "Thank you, you scumbags. I hope you die." Gunn got a further 9 years to run concurrently with his life term in 2007 for conspiring to corrupt Nottinghamshire police officers. His corruption of having trainee detective Charles Fletcher in his pocket had caught up with him. Just going back to the murder of Marvin Bradshaw, O'Brien was set a sentence of a minimum of 24 years, which was later reduced to 18 years. And 3 years later, Salmon would be given a life term with a minimum of 18 years. And as I said, with regards to the murders of John and Joan Stirland, nobody was actually convicted of the murders, but Gunn was sentenced to 35 years for conspiracy to murder the Stirlings, while John Russell was jailed for a minimum term of 30 years, and Michael McNee was jailed for at least 25 years. So guys, that's the story on a shooting of Marvin Bradshaw. A man shot dead outside a pub, and the shooter, Michael O'Brien, had no idea how harsh justice in the criminal world could be. And this ultimately led to the downfall of one of Nottinghamshire's most feared men. Let me know what you guys think. It's your boy GT. Keep it locked, keep it real.